Welcome back to the Sawdust Factory. In this episode, we're turning ornamental pine ring. This is a piece of pine I received from someone that I had turned some bowls for quite some time ago. It's the leftover material. The wood's kind of special to me, mainly because I've had it for a long time. It's been hanging around the shop for way too long. It is a piece of yellow pine, and I believe it to be hard pine. It came from a school they tore down, and the gymnasium floor was supported by these floor joists. It's about 3¼ inches thick. And the grain on it's super tight. Here I'm doing some rough math to figure out how large of a ring I can make from the stick I have. I have about 70 some inches, and I'm figuring out now that the largest part of the segment can be about 4¾ of an inch. I'll initially set up a cut on the table saw to square up the edge. When I had ripped the material down before, I must not have done a very good job of keeping one edge square to the other. So here I'm just slicing off the side. I'll do 2 passes on it. Here you can see the grain structure. It's very tight on one end. Growth rings are super narrow. I toyed around with the idea of trying to cut the segments on the table saw. Then I realized that the material was just too heavy and it would be hanging way too far off the sled. So I decided to do it on the miter saw instead. When I cut segments on the miter saw, I just marked the back guide with a pencil and put up a stop block. It's accurate enough to get a good enough ring, and you can make some adjustments to some pieces if you don't have a perfect ring. I've already made the first cut here. I simply flip it over, make sure I'm up against the stop block, and make a cut. And it's as easy as repeating that process 18 more times. Now that I have all 18 pieces, I can begin to lay them into a row. The last piece had a small flat spot on it. I just barely didn't have enough material for that one. And you'll see what that does here in a moment. So when I do a segment, I first lay out all the pieces and make sure I've got an even ring, no major gaps, and all the angles are somewhat correct. Then I'll bring it all together with hose clamps. Trying to find a long enough hose clamp section that can be adjusted tight. Sometimes it's challenging in the shop. I like to use a pair of channel locks to hold on to the screw assembly portion of the hose clamp. Doesn't tear up your hands. And I'll lay out my second hose clamp and really tighten up the assembly. You can see the gaps are pretty tight, with the exception of one location, which is right here, and that's where I had the flat spot from the end of the material. I decided not to move forward with that, take everything back to the miter saw, and cut just a little bit off of each one of the blocks so I can end up with a perfect ring. So here what I did is just move my stop block over slightly. Now I'm just going to shave a little bit off of each one. I ended up with a small wafer left over from each one, plus the thickness of the blade is about what the change in dimension turned out to be. Now I'm restacking all the pieces back into the ring. Tighten up the hose clamps again and check to make sure I didn't have any issues. Normally when I do a segment ring, I'll glue all the pieces at the same time. But because this was so big and there was so much surface area on each one of the segments, I decided to do it in partials. Tried to do 3 or 4 pieces the first time and then 3 or 4 pieces the second time. And I always use way too much glue when I'm doing this, but I want to make sure every part of that surface is completely covered. So here I'm tightening it back up, and I'll give it a couple hours or so, sometimes overnight depending on what's going on, before I move on to the next section. This is where I get a little bit impatient in the process, and I decided just to go ahead and glue the rest of it up in one go. The one important thing when doing segments, I find, is to make sure that you have all the pieces pushed down hard against the table. That way you end up with a nice flat surface. There's no greater satisfaction than pulling the hose clamps off of the finished segment, picking it up off the table, and stripping off the wax paper. I'm going to be putting this onto a large faceplate, I guess you'd call it, I have. It's kind of specific for doing this type of work. Mount various things to it that I'm going to have to glue down. And I'll use hot glue to affix the ring to the surface. You don't need a lot of hot glue. I'm applying it in 8 different locations at 45-degree increments. And before this, I marked out the surface of where the ring needed to go. That way, I could put it on wrong and then have to pick it up and move it over. There we go. Now it's in the right spot. The hot glue has a amazing holding force and a shear orientation. You can see here the concrete weights I've added to the bottom of the lathe. I have about 850 pounds worth of concrete in those 3 blocks. And it really reduces the vibration of the lathe. A lot of people have asked me why I didn't just bolt it to the floor, which I guess would have been an option, but it made it more difficult to move around, which I like to reposition a little bit every once in a while. So now I've got the faceplate mounted up, and I'm running the lathe. You can see it's a little bit out of true, but nothing too wild. I started on a corner cut here, just to knock it down and kind of get a feel for how it's going to turn. This wood turned super dry and very aromatic. There you can see what's coming off of it. A lot of fine pieces, almost like a dust. Now I almost have the whole outside of the ring trued up after this cut. And I'm kind of marking just where the center is. So that way I can create kind of a even shape. I'm going to do the same thing on the inside here. Get a nice, true surface. Take one last pass. This is the space I work in. I hang a lot of plastic up to try and reduce how far the chips go around the shop. They're actually shower curtains. Now I have a nice edge inside there. I did experience a little bit of tear out on the inside, but nothing too bad yet. Now I'll true the face up on the outside. It's where the shavings coming off here are kind of that curly cued format associated with segment turning. Now it's just a matter of kind of rounding off the corners from the marks I made. Starting to go after a cross section that looks like a circle. Attempted to do some shear scraping here to help improve some of the cuts I was getting. I was getting a little bit of tear out still, probably because the wood was so dry. And you can kind of see the degree of the shape of the chip coming off. I think I was turning about 500 or 600 RPM, but the piece was pretty big in diameter, so the outside surface was really moving. Doing some more shear scraping here. Now that I've got that contour I like on the outside, gave it a little bit of sanding. It really didn't need much. I come on the back side of the unit and knock off some of the auxiliary glue points I made. So I did add some more glue other than the 8 points I showed you earlier, just for extra retention. And it pops right off. Here I'm attempting to kind of mark where the ring is going to glue back onto the faceplate. And I'm going to try and cut into the faceplate the negative of that outside contour. So I have kind of a nest to set it in when I glue it down. This faceplate is made from some sort of compressed wood, shelves or something, and it's pretty nasty to turn. Really just makes a lot of sharp little pointed things and dust. So here I've kind of roughed out that shape. I give it a test fit. I was hoping it would nest right in, like in one location, but clearly I didn't have the impression deep enough, so I went back at it a second time. And it's a little bit better the second time, but still not exactly perfect. So I decided not to glue it in place on the lathe and to instead set it back down flat on the bench. That allows me just to kind of place it on there and eyeball it as in the center. I really didn't take any measurements. I just kind of looked at the gap in between where I made the cut and the edge of the ring from a fixed location. And then I just added some hot glue. I didn't put the hot glue underneath the ring, kind of in the joint. I just add it to the walls and use that to fix it in place. Kind of seeps down into that space. Now mounted back on the lathe, and you can see it's running pretty true. It's pretty good in my book, so I went with it. Now I'll add some additional hot glue on the outside in those 8 locations again. Yes, I'm at 500 and some RPM right there. And I'm just going along the face here. Mostly what I'm picking off is the hot glue from the last glue up, which really dulls up the gouge. I had to take it off and wire brush it off before I even put it on the grinder for sharpening. Just doing some rough face cuts just to bring that surface into true. Now I'm beginning to round over those edges. I think my gouge was pretty dull at this point in time. You can see it kind of bouncing around. Not really wanting to do the right cutting. Now I have a nicer surface, so I'm doing a push cut, riding the bevel of the gouge on the wood, getting a much better cut, much more consistent here. Still did have some tear out even after sharpening the gouge, so I'm doing some shear scraping on the surface just to clean it up a little bit. Switch tools here. I'm using a smaller gouge, trying to get in as close as possible to the spot I had to do some work in deep down inside there, and you can see some of the hot glue coming off. So I was pushing mine to luck a little bit Even though I had the hot glue on the outside, I was probably fine. Now I've got the shape I want, which isn't really a perfect circular cross section. That inside portion I had to leave a little bit. I didn't have much of a choice. So it's probably kind of egg shaped, and you can feel that a little bit by hand when you rub on it. I'm taking that paint scraper or whatever that is and just working my way around those glue joints. I've seen some people reheat them to try and get them off, but I think that just makes a bigger mess. Seems to me that if you just kind of work a sharp tool in between it and the wood and leave a little bit on the wood, you're less prone to damage it with grain tear out and things like that. I'm knocking out the inside ones, and then the ring will come off. Here I'm setting up a stand for it. I have some steel rod that was painted, and that base is a piece of walnut that I turned and then flamed, put some liming wax in the grain. It did have some cracks in it. It was actually intended to be a bowl, but sometimes I don't get all the way through a bowl roughing before one cracks. And instead of throwing the fire bin, I usually just set it off to the side and use it as a faceplate to turn the bottom of a bowl or something like that. And in this situation, it made a really nice base for the ring. The ring's going to be kind of up high anyways, where I'm going to put it, so you won't actually see the base much. I really wanted to try out that liming wax. Just using some 5-minute epox to affix the steel into the base. I'm carefully setting up the ring on my drill press to try and drill a hole in it as even as possible. Played around with the clamps a little bit to figure out if there was a good way to do this, and I kind of just decided to go for it at this point in time. I did have to put some tape around the portion of the rod that was going to go into the hole just to make it a little bit have bigger diameter so it would seat in there well. And now the moment of truth, applying the finish. The finish really made the wood pop, and it soaked it up really fast. I thought it looked pretty cool at the end. Pretty neat way to kind of show off a piece of wood that might otherwise get thrown out. So that's the end product. Thanks for watching, and check out the channel for more wood turning videos.